I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing the last of the plates from Sunday dinner, and listened to my family laughing in the living room. David was saying something about the office. Christina was picking up his words in her sonorous voice, and 16-year-old Brandon was occasionally inserting some comment about school. 14-year-old Ashley was silent, staring at her phone. The only requests made to me throughout the evening. David asked for more meat. Christina told me to bring napkins when Ashley spilled juice on the tablecloth. Brandon wanted more potatoes. I silently complied with all the requests, like a well-trained maid. The plates were warm from the hot water, and I wiped each one thoroughly with the towel I'd washed last night. Christina never cared for such little things. She believed that household chores would take care of themselves if she didn't pay attention to them. Perhaps it was because of me. "Mom, where's the dessert?" David's voice came from the living room. He didn't get up to walk toward the kitchen. Just shouted like I was a hired hand. I wiped my hands on my apron and pulled the apple pie I'd baked that morning out of the refrigerator. The dough was crumbly, the apples were juicy, and the cinnamon added a subtle flavor. David had always praised my pies before. Now he took them for granted. In the living room, everyone sat in chairs and on the couch, forming a cozy family circle from which I was excluded. My place was not there. I served the pie and brought out small plates, watching Christina carelessly cut herself a thin slice. "It's too sweet," she said, without even tasting it. "Ruth, you've overdone it again." I didn't say anything. It was perfect, and I knew it. The recipe had been passed down in my family for generations, and I'd been making it for over 50 years. But it was useless to contradict Christina. She always found flaws in my cooking, even though she ate every last crumb. Brandon took a big bite and began to eat with gusto. Ashley shook her head when I offered her dessert. "I'm on a diet," she mumbled, not looking away from her phone screen. David ate in silence, absent-mindedly flipping through some papers he'd brought with him to the table. Work consumed him completely. Even at home, he thought only about business, about projects, about how to impress his bosses. Sometimes I thought he had forgotten all of us existed, including me. After Harold died 3 years ago, everything changed. My husband was a gentle man, but David was more respectful in his presence. Harold did not allow his daughter-in-law to make barbed remarks about me and always thanked me for caring. Now I was living in my son's house like an unwanted guest who had stayed too long. "By the way, Mom," David finally pulled himself away from the papers and looked at me. "Ashley's math tutor is coming over tomorrow. Make sure they have tea and cookies." It wasn't a request. It was an order, given in a tone that didn't tolerate objection. I nodded, mentally adding another task to my already busy schedule. Tomorrow I had to take Brandon to soccer practice, pick up groceries, cook dinner for 6 people, and now tutoring. "Could I buy the cookies pre-made?" Christina asked, wiping her lips with a napkin. "You don't always have to bake them yourself." She made it sound like she cared about my time, but I knew the real reason. Christina wanted to save money on groceries. Home baking required butter, flour, and eggs, and ready-made cookies were cheaper. At the same time, she didn't hesitate to buy expensive face creams and new clothes every month. "I'll make my own," I replied. "It's not hard. It really isn't. Get up an hour early, make the dough, roll it out, cut out the cookies, bake them, cool them, arrange them nicely on a plate, then still make a good tea, heat milk if the tutor will drink coffee. Not difficult, except that I am 72 years old and already tired. But tired was an inappropriate luxury in this house. Everything here had to function clearly and smoothly, and I was part of that mechanism, the most invisible and least valuable part. I collected the empty pie plates and carried them into the kitchen. No one said thank you. No one offered to help. They continued to sit in the living room, discussing plans for tomorrow, in which I was to be the attendant. Ruth, did you wash my school uniform? Ashley called out from the living room. Yes, it's hanging in your closet, I answered as I continued washing dishes. And your jacket? It's going to be cold tomorrow. Jacket, too. Ashley didn't say thank you. She just went back to her phone, as if getting clean clothes was her birthright, not the result of my labor. Perhaps it was in her mind. The kids grew up in a house where Grandma acted as the invisible fairy who made sure everything was clean, tasty, and comfortable. The hot water burned my hands again as I washed the plates. The skin on my fingers became thin and sensitive, but I didn't complain. Complaining didn't interest anyone here. All that mattered was that the house functioned, the children were fed, the clothes were washed, and all the family's needs were met. The sound of the television came from the living room. David had switched to the news, and now the newscaster was talking in a measured voice about the events in the city. I listened half-heartedly, concentrating on washing the pan in which I was frying the chicken. The grease had embedded itself in the surface, and I had to scrub extra carefully. Mom, did you remember that Brandon has a game on Wednesday? Christina asked, appearing in the kitchen. We'd have to take him early, 4 o'clock. I nodded, even though I knew that Wednesday would also mean the doctor's appointment I'd been putting off for 2 months. My back pain was getting worse, but it was inappropriate to complain about my health in this house. Everyone had their own things to do, more important than the ailments of a 72-year-old woman. And don't forget your uniform, Christina added. It had to be perfectly clean. Coach pays attention to that sort of thing. Brandon's uniform was hanging in the laundry room, already washed and ironed. I'd taken care of it right after the last game, like I always did. But Christina reminded me of the obvious things, as if she thought I was incapable of remembering basic chores. It'll be ready, I said, putting a clean pan on the drying rack. Christina nodded and left without offering to help. She never stayed in the kitchen longer than it took to give orders: cooking, cleaning, laundry. All of it was my territory and therefore my responsibility. By the time I was done with the dishes, there was no one else in the living room. David had gone to his office. Christina had gone upstairs to her bedroom. The kids had scattered to their rooms. I was left alone amidst the immaculate cleanliness I created with my own hands every day. I walked through the house, making sure everything was in its place. The pillows on the couch were neatly fluffed, the magazines were stacked, and the TV remote was in its place. In the hallway, I picked up Brandon's jacket, which he'd thrown on the floor, and hung it in the closet. Ashley's shoes stood in the middle of the hallway. I put them on the shelf. Putting the grown children in order had become a habit. They'd grown up knowing that Grandma would always clean up after them, always cook, always make sure their lives were comfortable. Now they were 16 and 14, but they still didn't see fit to clean up after themselves. My little room on the first floor was quiet and cozy. It was the only part of the house that belonged only to me. Here stood my bed, dresser, and the chair Harold had given me for our 20th wedding anniversary. Here I could close the door and be alone with my thoughts. I sat in the chair and looked at the picture on the dresser. Harold was smiling at me from a black and white picture taken on our wedding day 50 years ago. Back then, we were young and full of plans. We dreamed of a large family, of a happy old age to spend together. But life took a different course. Harold died of a heart attack 3 years ago, quietly and quickly, in his sleep. I woke up next to his cold body, and at first I couldn't believe it. He had always been so lively, so energetic, so caring. It seemed impossible that he was gone. After the funeral, I stayed in the house because David told me there was no reason for me to live alone. It seemed caring at the time. Now I realized it was practicality. He needed a free housekeeper, and I had nowhere else to go. The house that Harold and I had lived in for 40 years, David sold it 6 months after my father died. He said the children would need the money for their education. that a big house was too expensive to maintain. I didn't object then because I was still in shock from losing my husband. Now I regretted my silence. Tomorrow it would all be the same again. Breakfast, cleaning, laundry, shopping, dinner. Day after day, week after week, no weekends, no holidays. Because what the family needed was not a mother and grandmother, but a free housekeeper who never gets sick, never gets tired, and doesn't ask unnecessary questions. But sometimes, in moments of silence, like now, I remembered how I used to be. Before marriage, before motherhood, before I became an invisible part of someone else's life. Back then, I had other plans, other dreams, and maybe not all was lost yet. Monday began at 7:30 in the morning with the sound of the alarm clock in David and Christina's bedroom. I had been awake for an hour, lying in my bed listening to the house wake up. First, the floorboards creaked upstairs, then the water in the shower, then the sound of hurried footsteps on the stairs. I got up, threw on my robe, and went into the kitchen to make breakfast. The coffee for David had to be strong, almost black. Christina preferred green tea with honey. Brandon had oatmeal with berries, and Ashley was content with yogurt and toast without butter. Everyone had their own preferences, and I remembered them all by heart. While the oatmeal cooked, I cut up the fruit and put it on plates. Apples for Brandon, bananas for Ashley, no citrus for Christina because they gave her heartburn. Little things that had accumulated over the years and turned into unbreakable household rules. Good morning, Mom. David came down first, already dressed in a business suit. His tie fit perfectly. His shirt was immaculately ironed. I took care of it last night, like I did every day. Good morning, I replied, pouring coffee into his favorite blue mug. He sat down at his desk and immediately pulled out his phone, checking his email. He didn't like to talk over breakfast, preferring to focus on the day ahead. I put a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him, but he barely nodded in acknowledgement, keeping his eyes on the screen. Christina showed up 10 minutes later, fresh and well-groomed, wearing a strict gray suit. Her blonde hair was neatly styled, her makeup flawless. She worked for an advertising agency and considered her appearance part of her professional duties. Ruth, did you remember to take Ashley to the doctor today? She asked, sitting down at her desk. The orthodontist's appointment is at 3 o'clock. I didn't forget. I'd written it in my notebook a week ago, next to the reminder to buy groceries and pick up the dry cleaning. My day was minute by minute, every task with its own time and place. I remember everything, I said, handing her the tea, and buy something for dinner, maybe some fish or chicken. Christina spoke absent-mindedly, leafing through some papers. Something light. I ate too much last night. She always said she was overeating, even though she ate less than everyone else at the table. Christina followed her figure with manic persistence, weighing herself every morning and writing down the results in a special diary. At the same time, she was not shy to criticize my cooking if the dish seemed to her too caloric. The kids came down almost simultaneously, sleepy and unhappy with the early rise. Brandon sat at the table in silence, staring at his plate. Ashley walked past, taking only an apple and heading for the exit. Ashley, have a normal breakfast, Christina said, not looking up from her papers. I don't want to. I'll miss the bus, she said. Grandma will take you to school, David said. Right, Mom? That wasn't a question either. It was a statement I had to agree with. I nodded, mentally calculating the time. Drive Ashley to school, come home, clean up after breakfast, go to the store, make lunch, take Ashley to the doctor, pick up Brandon from practice, make dinner. The day looked busy, but doable. The family dispersed in different directions a half hour after I served breakfast. David and Christina left for work in their cars, and I drove Ashley to school in the old sedan I'd inherited after Harold died. The girl was silent the whole way, staring at her phone, and didn't even say goodbye when she left at the school gate. The usual silence and disorder awaited me at home. Dirty dishes in the sink, crumbs on the table, scattered things in the hallway. I turned on the radio and started tidying up, listening to the morning gardening program. I'd always enjoyed washing dishes. It was a meditative activity that allowed my thoughts to flow freely. The warm water soothed my hands and the rhythmic motions helped me focus. Sometimes while washing the dishes, I remembered the past, when life was very different. 30 years ago, I worked as a secretary for a private detective agency in Stillwater. A small firm, only 3 employees, but we handled some interesting cases: cheating, fraud, missing persons, corporate investigations. I kept file cabinets, answered phones, and sometimes helped with surveillance and information gathering. I was a different woman then, sharp, observant, not afraid to ask uncomfortable questions. I had a knack for finding the right documents, watching discreetly, memorizing important details. My boss, Frank Richardson, said I had a natural talent for the job. But then I married Harold, had David, and the detective agency was a thing of the past. Harold didn't think it was the right job for a married woman. He wanted me to be a housewife, a mother, a homemaker. And I agreed because I loved him and believed that family was more important than career. Now, as I rinsed the plates, I sometimes wondered what would have happened if I hadn't listened to Harold. Maybe now I'd have a pension, my own apartment, independence. Perhaps I wouldn't be washing other people's dishes at 72. After cleaning the kitchen, I vacuumed the living room and dusted the furniture. Christina was picky about cleanliness, especially when guests came over. She would run her finger over the surfaces, checking for dust, and always found something to complain about. At 11:30, I went to the supermarket. The shopping list took up a whole page of my notebook: groceries for the week, household chemicals, medicines for the home medicine cabinet. I walked the aisles methodically, checking the list, choosing quality products at affordable prices. At the dairy section, I met Dorothy Wilson, a neighbor with whom I occasionally exchanged a few words. She lived alone after the death of her husband and seemed content with her life, always well-groomed, neatly coiffed, nicely dressed. "Hello, Ruth," she said. "How are you?" "Fine," I said, putting milk and cottage cheese in the basket. "How are you?" "I'm great. Yesterday I went to my daughter in Portland. Today I'm going to the theater with my friends. Life is wonderful when you don't owe anyone anything," laughed Dorothy. Her words echoed with pain in my chest. Dorothy was 3 years older than me, but she looked younger and happier. She had her own interests, her own plans, her own life. I had existed for the past 3 years only to serve someone else's needs. "Yeah, I guess so," I agreed, not wanting to continue the conversation. "Why don't you keep me company sometime?" Dorothy suggested. "Next Saturday we go to the exhibition of paintings. It's a very interesting exhibit." "Thank you, but I have a lot of things to do," I refused, although the exhibition sounded tempting. On Saturday, I had to prepare a big family dinner because David had invited some colleagues from work. I had to make a menu, buy groceries, prepare a few dishes, and set the table. No one asked if I wanted to spend the day off behind the stove. Dorothy nodded understandingly, but there was a flicker of sympathy in her gaze. She must have seen how my life had changed since moving in with my son. Harold and I used to invite her to tea sometimes, and she knew me as an independent, active woman. Now I was a shadow who only catered to other people's needs. I returned home at noon and immediately began to prepare dinner: vegetable soup for Christina, meat cutlets for David, macaroni and cheese for the kids. To each his own according to taste and dietary preferences. Cooking different meals was more difficult, but no one in the family was willing to compromise. While the soup boiled, I ironed the laundry. The pile grew each day: David's shirts, Christina's blouses, the children's school uniforms, linens, towels. The iron glided rhythmically over the fabric, leaving behind perfectly flat surfaces. I ironed carefully because Christina noticed every crease. At 2 o'clock, I had to go pick Ashley up from school in time for her doctor's appointment. The girl got in the car unhappy, sulking all the way to the clinic. The orthodontist had been examining her braces for half an hour, and I was sitting in the hallway reading old magazines. "Everything is fine," the doctor said when the procedure was over. "The teeth are aligning perfectly. My next appointment is in a month." Ashley breathed a sigh of relief. She was self-conscious about her braces and wished she could get rid of them sooner. I understood her feelings. I had been self-conscious about her uneven teeth as a child, but I didn't have the money for an orthodontist. On the way home, Ashley suddenly said, "Grandma, have you ever worked?" "I did," I said, surprised by the question. "Before I was married." "Where?" "At a detective agency." Ashley turned to me with interest. "Really? You were a detective?" "Not a detective, but I helped with investigations," I explained. "It was a long time ago before your dad was born." "Cool," Ashley exclaimed. "Why did you quit?" Good question, I thought. Why did you give up an interesting job to be a homemaker? Because it was the right thing to do? Because Harold thought it was the right thing to do? Or because she believed that a woman's place was at home? "Married, had children," I said simply. "Do you regret it?" I was silent, thinking over the answer. Do I regret it? Sometimes, yes, especially in recent years, when I'd become an invisible part of someone else's life. But it seemed inappropriate for a 14-year-old girl to talk about it. "Everyone chooses their own path," I said diplomatically. Ashley nodded, but I could see that my answer didn't satisfy her. Maybe she was thinking about her own future, about the choices she would make when she grew up. Hopefully, she would be wiser than I was. Waiting for us at home was Brandon, who came home from practice hungry and tired. I heated up his lunch and sat next to him, watching him eat. The boy looked just like his father at that age. Same stubborn chin, same dark eyes, same focus. "How was practice?" I asked. "It was okay," Brandon answered, not looking away from his plate. "Coach said I could make the main team if I practiced more." "That's great," I said sincerely. Brandon nodded and continued eating. Talking to my grandchildren was hard for me. They were used to seeing me only as a support staff, someone who cooked, cleaned, and drove them to practice. Ashley showed interest in my past for the first time today, and it was unexpectedly pleasant. In the evening, when the whole family gathered for dinner, I served the meal and listened to them talk. David talked about problems at work. Christina complained about a difficult client. The kids discussed schoolwork. I only joined in the conversation when they asked me something about the household. After dinner, I was again washing dishes, clearing the table, preparing for the next day. Life went on, day after day, week after week. And sometimes I thought I had forgotten what I used to be like when I had my own plans and dreams. Friday night, David asked me to stay after dinner. The kids had gone to their room, Christina had gone up to her bedroom, and we were alone in the living room. He sat in his favorite chair, and I stood by the window, wiping my hands with a kitchen towel. A fine rain drizzled behind the glass, and the drops ran down the surface like tears. "Mom, we need to talk," David said, setting the paper aside. His voice had that peculiar seriousness in it that always presaged an unpleasant conversation. It was the tone he used when he was firing bad employees or explaining new rules of behavior to children, official, detached, unobjectionable. "Yes," I said, sitting down on the edge of the couch. David paused, choosing his words. He was looking away from me, not at me, as if he were preparing for a business presentation. His face was tense, his eyebrows drawn together in the familiar crease between his eyes. "I've been thinking about our situation for a long time." he began finally. How we live our lives, what we get out of it for all sides. And I've come to the conclusion that change is needed. I was silent, feeling my insides tighten with foreboding. David spoke as if he were talking about the reorganization of the company, not about the fate of his own mother. You see, Mom, the current arrangement suited everyone as long as it was temporary, but it's been 3 years. The kids are grown. We have new needs, new plans. Christina wants to move up the career ladder. I'm going to make some serious changes at work, too. He spoke in a streamlined manner, not getting to the point. It was another trait he had inherited from his corporate job. First, general phrases, then a gradual narrowing down to specific sentences. I knew this method and realized that the main thing was yet to come. Anyway, Christine and I discussed the situation and decided that we needed to clarify our relationship. David continued. Define responsibilities, boundaries of responsibility, mutual expectations. What are you talking about? I asked, even though I was beginning to understand. Uncertainty isn't good for anyone. You live in our house. We provide you with shelter and food. In exchange, you help with the household chores. But this relationship is not formalized. There is no clear understanding of what is your responsibility and what is not. David stood up and walked to the fireplace, turning his back to me. It was easier for him to talk without making eye contact. I looked at his broad shoulders in his expensive jacket, his neatly trimmed hair, the confident posture of a successful manager. We are ready to offer you a formalized relationship, he said, looking into the fire. You become our full-time housekeeper and nanny. We provide you with lodging, food, a small salary. You take over housekeeping, cooking, childcare when needed. The words fell into the silence of the living room like stones into a deep well. Housekeeper, nanny, salary. My own son was offering to be a hired maid in the house that used to be mine. Of course it has to be formalized properly, David continued, still not turning around. A contract of employment, a definite schedule, clear responsibilities. No amateurishness, no pretensions to a special position in the family. It's just a job. And if I refuse? I asked quietly. David finally turned to me. His face was calm, even friendly, but his eyes remained cold. Then we'll have to find another solution, he said. Mom, you're not old anymore. You're 72 years old. At your age, people need constant care, medical supervision, social support. We can't provide you with all of that fully. He was silent for a moment, giving me time to realize the meaning of his words. There are excellent facilities for the elderly, he continued gently, comfortable, with qualified staff, a variety of recreational programs. Sunny glades in the suburbs, for example. I've already made inquiries. Very decent place. Nursing home. He threatened me with a nursing home if I didn't agree to be an official servant in my own family. I looked at my son, this successful man in an expensive suit, and I didn't recognize the boy I'd raised, the boy I'd read stories to, the boy I'd comforted after failures at school. Think about it, David said, returning to his chair. You have plenty of time. Say, until the end of the month. It's a fair offer, Mom. We give you a chance to stay with your family, to be useful, to feel needed. Isn't that better than sitting idle among strangers? Useful, needed, like I was a broken tool that could still be used, if used correctly. I sat on the edge of the couch, clutching a kitchen towel in my hands, and felt something inside me finally break. Is Christina okay with this decision? I asked. Of course, it was her plan from the beginning. She believes that uncertainty is bad for family relationships. It's better to settle things right away than to deal with misunderstandings later. So this was Christina's idea. Turn the mother-in-law into an official servant, get full control over her life, eliminate even a hint of equality in the relationship. Smart, Practical, efficient, typical corporate culture solution. I'll think about it, I said, rising from the couch. Good. David smiled, satisfied that the unpleasant conversation was over. I knew you'd understand the logic of our reasoning. After all, we all want what's best for the family. I walked out of the living room without responding to his words. The hallway was dark and quiet, only the ticking of the old clock that remembered Harold. I walked to my room and closed the door behind me. The silence enveloped me like a thick blanket. I sat down in a chair and tried to comprehend what had happened. My son, the only child I had loved all my life, had offered me a choice between servant status and a nursing home, a choice between humiliation and exile. He talked about it calmly, businesslike, as if it were about buying a new car or changing insurance. No emotion, no sympathy, no understanding of what he was doing to his own mother. Just cold calculation and practical considerations. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain was still drizzling behind the glass, turning the street into a blurry watercolor. The lanterns reflected in the puddles with yellow stains, and rare cars carefully drove around the water obstacles. The world outside the window lived its own life, unaware of the drama that was unfolding in this room. For 3 years I had lived in this house as an unwanted guest. 3 years of neglect, barbs, indifference. I consoled myself that it was temporary, that relations would improve, that the family would become a family again. How naive I was. David and Christine were never going to accept me as an equal. I was a convenient solution to their domestic problems, a free labor force that saved them time and money. Now they had decided to legitimize this situation, to make it official, a full-time housekeeper, no claims to a special position in the family, labor contract, a set schedule. Like I was a stranger hired to clean and cook, not the homeowner's mother. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Harold's picture. His kind eyes looked at me with warmth and understanding. What would he have said when he heard of his son's proposal? Probably would have been outraged, upset, disappointed. Harold always treated me with respect, even when he disagreed with my decisions. But Harold is gone, and I was left alone with a choice that wasn't really a choice. Accept the humiliation or go into a nursing home where I would slowly fade away among strangers. The prospect of both was equally frightening. I stood up and walked over to the old dresser that stood against the wall. It was the only furniture I had brought from my old home. In the bottom drawer, under a stack of yellowed photos and old letters, was a small wooden box. I hadn't opened it in years. Even Harold didn't know it existed. It was my secret, a part of my past life that I had studiously forgotten all these decades. But now that I was faced with a choice between dignity and a roof over my head, maybe it was time to remember. The box was heavy, though it looked fragile. The dark wood tarnished with time, the brass clasp blackened. I put it on the dresser next to my husband's picture and stared at it for a long time, hesitating to open it. Inside were documents, photographs, notes that I had collected in my youth, working in a detective agency, materials that I thought had been lost or destroyed, evidence of human frailties, proof of secret deals, dirt on people who considered themselves untouchable. Back then, 30 years ago, I made copies of the most interesting cases, not out of self-interest, just to be on the safe side. It seemed to me that such information might come in handy someday. Then I got married, forgot about work, hid the box, and never thought of its contents again. But memory has a way of coming back at the most unexpected moments. And now, looking at the worn wooden surface, I remembered exactly what was inside, including the case files we'd investigated in 1995, a corruption case involving a construction company called Stone and Partners, the same company where my son now works. I ran my fingers over the clasp of the box, feeling my hands shake slightly with excitement. The past suddenly became the present. Forgotten secrets took on new meaning. Perhaps I have a choice. Perhaps there is a third way that David doesn't even know about. Slowly, almost solemnly, I opened the lid of the box. The next morning, I got up early as usual and made breakfast for the family. David came down at 7:30, fresh and energetic, as if yesterday's conversation hadn't bothered him at all. He drank coffee, watched the news on his phone, and occasionally glanced in my direction with the look of a man waiting for a response to a reasonable offer. I silently served him scrambled eggs and bacon, poured fresh coffee, and cleared the table. My movements were calm and familiar, but inside I felt a mixture of determination and cold rage. Last night I'd spent a long time studying the contents of the box, refreshing my memory, reconstructing the details of a case from 30 years ago. Christina had shown up for breakfast in high spirits. She was humming to herself as she picked out her outfit for the day, and she gave me a few meaningful glances. Apparently, David had told her about yesterday's conversation, and she was awaiting my decision with ill-concealed impatience. "It's a beautiful morning, isn't it, Ruth?" she said, sitting down at the table. "It is so good to have clarity and understanding in the family." I didn't answer, continuing to clear the dishes. David looked up from the phone and looked at his wife with a slight warning. Even he thought Christina was being a little too overtly triumphant. The children ate breakfast in silence and left for school. David and Christina got ready for work, leaving the usual directions for the day. I had to take Brandon to the doctor, pick up the dry cleaning, and buy groceries for the weekend. A routine set of tasks that I had been doing automatically for 3 years now. But today was different. Today I had the key to the jewelry box in my pocket and a plan of action ripening in my head. I waited for a convenient moment when I could talk to David alone without Christine and the kids. The opportunity presented itself in the evening. Christina had gone to a friend's house. The kids were doing their homework, and David was in his office with his laptop. I knocked on the door and walked in, holding an old wooden box. "Mom, I'm busy," David said, not taking his eyes off the screen. "If this is about last night's conversation, you have plenty of time to think." "It's about last night," I replied, setting the box on his desk. David finally looked up and saw the unfamiliar object. His eyebrows rose in surprise. "What is it?" he asked. "Something from my past," I said, sitting down in the chair across the table. "Something you never knew about." I opened the lid of the box and pulled out some files. The papers were yellowed from time, but the text was still clear and legible. David watched my actions with bewilderment and growing concern. "Remember I told you I worked at a detective agency?" I began, spreading out the papers on the table. "We handled all kinds of cases: cheating, fraud, corporate investigations. One of those investigations involved a construction company called Stone and Partners. At the mention of the firm's name, David straightened sharply in his chair. His eyes narrowed and his face became tense. "What are you trying to say?" he asked cautiously. "I want to show you something interesting," I said, pulling some photographs out of the folder. The first picture was taken outside a restaurant in downtown Stillwater. It showed two men handing each other a thick envelope. The picture was black and white, grainy, but the faces were clearly distinguishable. A young Richard Stone, then in his early 40s, and a city official, Robert Miller. David took the photograph and studied it closely. I could see his face pale, his fingers trembling as he held the picture. "Where did you get this?" he wheezed. "I told you, I worked for a detective agency. We were following Stone for a rival firm. We suspected he was bribing officials to get lucrative contracts. I put some more photos in front of him. Meetings at coffee shops, handing over money, shaking hands after deals were made. A whole gallery of compromising shots. depicting the system of corruption that the young and ambitious businessman had built. But the most interesting thing is not the photos, but the documents, I said, pulling photocopies of bank statements out of the folder. Your boss was very careless with money in those days, left a trail that was easy to trace. David grabbed the documents and began to study them feverishly. I could see him recognizing familiar names, dates, amounts. I saw him realize the scale of the dirt that lay on his desk. Richard Stone was awarded 3 major municipal contracts between 1994 and 1996. I explained calmly. Construction of the school, renovation of the city hall, and reconstruction of the city park. The contracts totaled over $12 million. David was silent, flipping through the pages. His face grew increasingly gray. To get each contract, he paid bribes to the appropriate officials, I continued. Robert Miller of the Education Department, James Walker of the Administrative Department, Thomas Brown of the Beautification Committee. The bribes ranged from 5 to 10% of the contract value. It was 30 years ago. David finally squeezed out. The statute of limitations. Expired, yes, I agreed. Legally, Richard Stone can no longer be held accountable for those crimes. But imagine what would happen if this information became public. I pulled out another document, a case summary from my former boss, Frank Richardson. Fraud, corruption, money laundering, I read aloud. Creating a criminal scheme involving municipal employees. Over $1 million in damages to the city's budget. That's an impressive list, isn't it? David set the documents aside and looked at me with the expression of a man who'd seen a ghost. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked gruffly. "Because you offered me a choice between servant status and a nursing home yesterday," I replied flatly. "And now I have an offer of my own." I gathered up the papers and put them neatly back in the folder. "Richard Stone is one of the most powerful men in the city right now," I said. "He's the head of a major corporation, a city councilman, a sponsor of charitable organizations. His reputation is impeccable. Imagine what would happen if reporters got copies of those documents." David turned even paler. He understood the consequences better than I did. The scandal surrounding Stone would inevitably affect all of his employees, especially those in high positions. The career that David had spent his life building on would collapse overnight. "You can't do this," he whispered. "It's blackmail." "No, son," I objected gently. "It's just information, facts I've accidentally discovered in my old papers. What I do with them is my right." I closed the box and stood up, getting ready to leave. "Think about my offer," I said, heading for the door. "You have plenty of time, say, until the end of the month. That's fair, isn't it?" I turned around on the doorstep. David was sitting at his desk with his arms around his head. His confidence, his patronizing tone, his cold superiority, it was all gone in an instant. "And by the way," I added, "about the nursing home. Sunny Glades is a really nice place. I've been making inquiries. Too bad you'll have to find a new job soon to pay for my stay there, though it's unlikely your next paycheck will be as high as your current one." David raised his head and looked at me. In his eyes was the expression of a man who, for the first time in years, had lost control of the situation. "What do you want?" he asked tiredly. "Nothing much," I answered. "I just want to live my life the way I think I should. No ultimatums, no threats, no becoming a servant. I think you'll understand the logic of my reasoning. After all, we all want what's best for the family." I left the office, leaving my son alone with his thoughts and his new reality. The hallway was quiet, only the ticking of an old clock that remembered the time when this house was my home, not someone else's territory. The box in my hand seemed lighter than before. Perhaps because the weight of secrets was no longer weighing on my shoulders. Or maybe it was because for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was not a victim of circumstance, but mistress of my own destiny. Not a sound came from the study. David was probably trying to make sense of what had happened, to find a way out of a situation that an hour ago had seemed completely under his control. But there was no way out, at least not one that would suit him. I went into my room and put the box on the dresser next to Harold's picture. My husband was smiling at me from the picture, and I thought I saw a glow of approval in his eyes. Perhaps he would be proud of me today. Perhaps he would have realized that sometimes you have to fight for your dignity. Sunday morning, David knocked on my door earlier than usual. I was already up and about to go make breakfast, but his appearance stopped me in my tracks. He looked tired, like he'd spent a sleepless night thinking about our conversation last night. His eyes were red, his hair disheveled, and his cheeks were stubbled with unshaven stubble. "May I come in?" he asked, and his voice didn't have the confidence of yesterday. I nodded and stepped aside. David made his way into the room and sat down in the chair that used to belong to his father. I remained standing by the window, watching him gather his thoughts. "I need to know the details," he said finally. "How did you get those documents? How did you get this information about Stone's company?" I sat on the edge of the bed across from him. It was a gray morning outside the window, with low clouds in the sky, and it looked like it was going to start raining any minute. The weather matched the mood of the conversation. "I told you I worked for a detective agency," I began calmly. "A small firm called Richardson and Associates, 3 employees. Frank Richardson was the owner, Jack Thompson was the senior detective, and I was the secretary and investigative assistant." David listened attentively, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. It was hard for him to imagine his mother as a private detective. "In 1994, we were approached by a construction company called Blackwood Enterprises," I continued. "They had lost every tender to Stone's company for the second year in a row, even though their bids were more favorable. The owner of the firm, Arthur Blackwood, suspected foul play." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the empty street. Memories came back slowly, like frames of an old movie. "For the first 2 weeks, we just studied the paperwork," I said, "analyzing bids, comparing prices, looking for patterns. Jack said that if there's corruption, there must be traces of it. Sooner or later, money leaves traces." "And did you find those traces?" David asked. "Not right away. First, we came upon Robert Miller from the Department of Education. A modest official, a salary of $3,000 a month, but he lives like a millionaire. New house, expensive car, private school for his kids, a clear discrepancy between income and expenses." I turned to my son. He sat leaning forward, completely absorbed in the story. We started following Miller. Frank rented an apartment across the street from his building. I got a job as a waitress at a restaurant where he often dined. Jack was on duty outside the bank where Miller kept his accounts. Classic surveillance operation. "And what did you find?" "That Miller met regularly with Richard Stone, not in the office, not at official functions, but in secret. Restaurants, cafes, parks. At these meetings, envelopes would be exchanged. Miller would receive, Stone would pass." I sat back on the bed, continuing my story. I was assigned to photograph these meetings. I always had good reactions and a steady hand, perfect for covert photography. I used a camera with a telephoto lens, shot from the car, from behind trees, from the windows of buildings. I had a whole collection of compromising footage. David was silent, digesting the information. I knew it was a shock for him to learn about this side of my life. In his mind, I had always been a housewife, a dutiful wife, and a caring mother. But photographs were only half the story, I continued. There had to be documentary evidence. bank statements, transfer records, traces of money transactions, and that's where the skills I'd learned at the agency came in handy. What skills? David asked warily. The ability to gain people's trust, to get information, to find the right documents. I became friends with a secretary at the bank where Miller worked. Simple woman, liked to talk, complained about her low salary. I listened to her, sympathized, sometimes bought her lunch. David frowned, disapproving of the methods I described. She showed me Miller's account statements, I admitted. Not out of self-interest, just to brag about how much money was going through their bank. And I memorized dates, amounts, account numbers. I've always had a good memory for details. That's illegal, David pointed out. Yes, I agreed. And we understood that. But the client was paying good money, and it was almost impossible to prove corruption by legal means. Frank said that sometimes you had to choose between law and justice. I stood up and walked over to the dresser and picked up Harold's picture. Your father didn't know the nature of my work, I said quietly. He thought I was just doing paperwork, answering phones, typing reports, and I didn't dissuade him. I didn't want him to worry. And then you quit your job, David said. I did. When we got married, Harold asked me to leave the agency. He said a woman should be busy with her home and family, not wandering around town with a camera. I said yes because I loved him. I put the photo back where it belonged and turned to my son. But before I left, I made copies of the most interesting cases. Stone's case was one of them. I don't know why I left the files, maybe out of sentimentality. Or maybe I had a hunch they'd come in handy someday. David stood up and paced the room, thinking about what he'd heard. I could see that he was looking for a way to turn the situation in his favor, to find a weakness in my reasoning. These documents are illegally obtained, he said at last. They can't be used as evidence in court. Any lawyer could easily challenge them. Right, I agreed. But I don't need a trial. All I need is publicity. Journalists don't need the same level of proof as judges. All they need is an interesting story with facts and documents. David stopped at the window, looking out at the empty street. His shoulders slumped, and I realized that he was beginning to realize the hopelessness of his situation. What do you want? He asked without turning around. Money? An apartment? A car? I want freedom, I said simply. To be able to live the life I wanted. Not to be a servant to my own family, not to listen to threats about a nursing home. David turned to face me. There was a mixture of despair and anger in his eyes. Okay, he said sharply. Let's forget about yesterday's conversation. No employment contract, no official duties. Live as before. We won't change anything. No, I shook my head. It's too late to go back to the way things were. Yesterday you showed me what you really think of me. Relationships can't be repaired like broken things. Then what? David exploded. You want to ruin my career over one careless conversation? I want to leave, I said calmly. Get my own place, start a new life, and take the box with me, of course. David turned pale. You can't go away. You have no money, no job, no— I have a pension. I interrupted him. It's not much, but it's enough for a modest life. And as for a job, maybe I'll find something suitable. At my age, it's hard, but not impossible. Mom, be reasonable. David tried a different approach. You're 72 years old. It's dangerous to live alone. What if something happens to your health? What if you need help? Then I'll go to social services, I replied. Or the same nursing home you suggested yesterday. But it would be my choice, not my compulsion. David sat back in his chair and wrapped his arms around his head. You do realize what you're doing, don't you? He muttered. Stone will find out where the leak came from. I'll be fired the first day. I'll never get another job in this field. Maybe, I agreed. But that's your problem, not mine. You made your choice yesterday when you gave me an ultimatum. Now reap the consequences. I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. I have a proposition, David said quickly. Let's make a deal. You stay here, destroy the documents, and I'll treat you better. With respect. Understanding. It's too late. I shook my head. Too much water had flowed under the bridge. Too many resentments have built up. I need to start over, somewhere else, with a clean slate. David looked at me with the expression of a man who sees his whole life crumbling. Give me time, he pleaded. A month, 2 weeks. I'll find a way to solve the paperwork problem. You have time, I said, heading for the door, just until I find a new place to live and pack up my things, and the box will stay with me forever. It's a guarantee that you'll never try to force me to do anything again. I left the room, leaving my son alone with his thoughts and fears. The hallway smelled of the breakfast I had yet to make, but this was the last breakfast I would cook in this house as a free maid. That would soon change. Monday morning, I called several real estate agencies while the family was at work and school. The list of rental apartments in Stillwater was short, but a few options seemed suitable. Small studio apartments downtown, close to shopping and public transportation. The prices were a bit steep, but my pension plus a small savings allowed for a modest but independent existence. I signed up to view 3 apartments on Tuesday and Wednesday. One was in an old brick house on Main Street, one in a modern complex on the outskirts, and one in a quiet neighborhood near the library. Each had its advantages and disadvantages, but the main advantage was common. It was my personal space where no one could dictate my living conditions. After lunch, I began to slowly sort through my belongings. My room had accumulated surprisingly few personal items over the 3 years of living in my son's house. A few sets of clothes, books, photos, a file box, Harold's chair. Everything else belonged to the house, not to me. I carefully folded the blouses and skirts into an old suitcase I'd once taken on vacation with Harold. The fabrics were faded with time. Some things needed mending, but they were my clothes, bought with my money. It's strange how little one needs to live when one gets rid of illusions and focuses on the essentials. Books I packed in cardboard boxes I found in the basement. Novels, detectives, memoirs, companions for lonely evenings when the family watched TV in the living room and I stayed in my room. Some I reread several times, finding comfort and understanding in the familiar stories. While packing, I came across old letters from Harold that he had written to me during business trips, short notes full of tenderness and concern. I miss your voice. I can't wait to come home. You're the best wife ever. Simple words, but sincere. Harold was never eloquent, but he was always honest. I reread a few letters and folded them back neatly. These memories would stay with me no matter where I moved. They reminded me of times when I was needed and loved, not just tolerated for practical reasons. Christina got home around 6 in the evening and immediately noticed the boxes in my room. The door was ajar and the boxes were standing against the wall, ready to be transported. She knocked and entered uninvited, which was typical of her. "Ruth, what's this?" she asked, pointing to the boxes. "Are you doing some house cleaning?" "I'm moving," I answered simply, continuing to pack my suitcase. Christina froze on the doorstep. Her face stretched in surprise and her eyes opened wide. "Move? Where? What do you mean?" "I'm renting an apartment in the city," I explained, not lifting my head from my suitcase. "I'm going to look at a few options tomorrow. I think it'll be ready by the end of the week." Christina entered the room and closed the door behind her. Her movements were abrupt, nervous. She clearly hadn't expected this turn of events. "But why?" she asked with feigned concern. "Are you unwell here? Did we say something wrong? Did we hurt you?" I finally looked up and looked at her. Christine was standing in the middle of the room in an expensive business suit. with impeccable makeup and neat hair. She looked like a successful businesswoman who had been unexpectedly informed of a glitch in an important project. David didn't tell you about our conversation on Friday? I asked. Christine blushed slightly, which showed that she was aware of it. I did, she admitted. Noun. But I thought you two would work things out, find a compromise. Adults can always find a mutually acceptable solution. We did, I said, putting the old photos in the box. I'm moving out, you're staying. Everybody's fine. But that's crazy, Christina exclaimed, losing her temper. You're 72 years old. You can't live alone. It's dangerous. What if something happens? What if you get sick? It was funny to hear the same arguments David had made the day before. They must have been rehearsing this conversation, preparing for my resistance to their plans. I'll be fine, I answered succinctly. Christine sat on the edge of the bed, assuming a trusting pose. Ruth, let's talk honestly, she said in a soft voice. I know I can be abrupt sometimes. Work, stress, fatigue. You know how it is. But I didn't mean to hurt you. You're an important part of our family. She sounded sincere, almost heartfelt. If I didn't know her better, I would have believed those words. But in 3 years of living in the same house, I'd gotten to know her habits well, and I knew that I was now seeing Christine as a caring daughter-in-law trying to resolve a family conflict. The important part? I asked, pausing in my packing. What do you mean? Well, you help us, take care of the kids, run the household, Christina listed. Without you, it would be much harder for us to balance work and family responsibilities. That's the real worry. Christina was not worried about my well-being, but about how the family would function without a free housekeeper. Who would make breakfast, take the kids to doctor's appointments, do laundry, clean, buy groceries? Hiring a housekeeper is expensive, and they don't have time to do everything themselves. You'll find a way to manage, I said, returning to the package. Hire a helper or divide the responsibilities between you. Modern families somehow manage without grandmothers living at home. But we are a family, Christina protested. Families should stick together, help each other, support each other in times of need. The word family sounded almost mocking in her mouth. For 3 years, she had treated me like an unwanted freeloader, and now she remembered family values. David asked me to be your official servant, I reminded her. Was this your idea of family support? Christina blushed even more and averted her eyes. It was a bad suggestion, she mumbled. David had meant well, but he had been inaccurate. Of course, no one thought of you as a servant. They thought of you as free labor, I countered, which is pretty much the same thing. There were footsteps and voices in the hallway. The children had come home from school. Usually they went straight to their rooms, but today they stopped at my door, attracted by the unusual conversation. Grandma, what's going on? Ashley asked, peering into the room. I'm packing, I said. I'm moving into my own apartment. Ashley and Brandon looked at each other. In 3 years, they'd gotten used to my presence in the house and saw me as part of the decor. The thought of me leaving had obviously never crossed their minds. Why? Brandon asked. Don't you like it here? It was the first time he'd ever shown interest in my feelings. Usually our interactions were limited to requests for rides, food, or laundry. I just want to live on my own, I explained, trying not to get into the details of the family conflict. But who's going to cook breakfast? Ashley asked practically. Christina glanced quickly at her daughter and then at me. Panic flashed in her eyes. She knew that the kids were beginning to realize the magnitude of the problems that would arise after I left. We'll manage, she said uncertainly. We'll learn to cook on our own, or we'll order food. Who's going to drive me to the orthodontist? Ashley continued. And buy groceries and iron my school uniform? Every question was a blow to Christina. She clearly hadn't thought through the practicalities of my leaving, focusing only on how to convince me to stay. We'll, we'll talk it over and figure it out, she mumbled. Brandon walked over to the boxes and peered into one of them. And your books? He asked. And Grandpa's chair? Are you taking everything with you? Yes, I answered. Those are my things, and they'll go with me to my new home. He nodded, thinking it over. To the teenagers, my packing must have seemed like the beginning of a great adventure. They didn't understand the conflict, but they sensed that something important and irreversible was happening. Would we be able to come visit? Ashley asked me out of the blue. Her question caught me off guard. In 3 years, she'd never shown much interest in talking to me. Maybe the need to break up had made her rethink our relationship. Of course, I replied. I'm always happy to see you if you want to. Christine got up from the bed, clearly unhappy with the direction the conversation had taken. Kids, go do your homework, she said. Grandma and I will talk more. Ashley and Brandon left the room reluctantly. I could hear them whispering in the hallway, discussing the news. For the first time in a long time, they thought of me as a living person, not just a source of domestic services. Ruth, please. Christine returned to a trusting tone. Don't rush into a decision. Give us time to think it over, to find the best option for everyone. Maybe we do need to make some changes in our relationship, but not by cutting ties. You'll have time, I replied, closing my suitcase. I won't disappear from the city. I'll just live separately and build my own life. Christina looked at me with the expression of someone who realizes that arguments don't work, but doesn't know what to do next. For 3 years, she had gotten used to me giving in, agreeing, submitting. My resistance came as a surprise to her. You won't change your mind? She asked me in a final attempt. No, I answered firmly. The decision had been made. The apartment on Main Street was perfect. It was small but bright, with high ceilings and large windows overlooking an old lime tree that had been growing in the yard for 100 years. The owner, an elderly man named Frank Collins, showed me around the amenities with the look of a man who understands what it means to start over at a young age. My aunt lived here until she died, he said, opening the windows for air. She lived for 93 years and was independent until her last day. She said that independence was more expensive than any amenities. The apartment consisted of one large room, which served as a bedroom and a living room, a small kitchen and a tiny bathroom. The furniture was old but good, a wooden dining table, 2 chairs, a sofa bed, a bookcase, a chest of drawers, everything necessary for a simple but decent life. The rent is $450 a month, including utilities, said Mr. Collins. A deposit of 1 month's rent, plus the first month's rent in advance. No pets, no smoking. The rest of the rules are standard. The amount was within my budget, though it left a little for emergencies. I signed the contract the same day, handed over the money, and got the keys. Mr. Collins wished me luck and told me that if I needed help moving, he knew some good guys who would move things inexpensively. The move took place on Friday. 2 students from the local college carefully moved my boxes, suitcase, and Harold's chair into their new home. They worked quickly and carefully, realizing they were dealing with things that were important to me, not so much materially as emotionally. David and Christina were at work during the move. I purposely chose a time when they weren't home to avoid unpleasant scenes and attempts to change my mind at the last minute. I left only a note on the kitchen table. Moved in. Address: 237 Main Street, Apartment 4. Ruth. The kids were at school, so I couldn't say goodbye to them. I wrote them separate notes and left them on their beds along with small gifts. Ashley, a beautiful notepad that I'd wanted to buy for a long time, but had been saving up. To Brandon, a book about famous soccer players that I saw on his Christmas wish list. By the evening, I was a full-fledged mistress of my own home. I put things in their places, arranged the books on the shelves, hung the pictures on the walls. I put Harold's chair by the window, which overlooked the street and the old lime tree. I put the file box in the dresser and locked it. When everything was ready, I made tea and sat in my husband's chair, looking out at the evening street. People walking home from work strolled along the sidewalk. The lights in the windows of neighboring houses were on. The evening ritual of family life was beginning, and I was sitting in my own apartment, owing nothing to anyone, reporting to no one. Freedom was a physically tangible sensation. It filled my lungs with fresh air, squared my shoulders, smoothed out the wrinkles of anxiety on my forehead. For the first time in 3 years, I could choose what to do, when to get up, what to make for dinner, what book to read before bed. Simple things that most people take for granted had become a luxury for me. The phone rang around 8 in the evening. David had found my note and apparently didn't believe I was really gone. His voice sounded worried, almost panicked. "Mom, what have you done?" he blurted out as soon as I picked up the phone. "Why didn't you tell me? We could have helped with the move, discussed the details, made sure you were safe there." "Everything went fine," I answered calmly. "The move is over and I'm settled into my new apartment. Everything's fine." "But you realize it's only temporary, don't you?" David insisted. "You can't make such important decisions under stress. Stay there for a week or two, calm down, and then we'll go back to discussing options." He still didn't realize that my decision was final. In his mind, I was still a foolish old woman who did stupid things, but would sooner or later come to her senses and return to being a reasonable person. "David," I said patiently, "I'm not going back. This is not a whim or a temporary measure. It is my choice for the remaining years of my life." "But how will you live?" he protested. "Rent, groceries, utilities. You don't have much income." "My pension is enough," I replied. "I'll save money, plan my expenses, maybe find a part-time job. Millions of people live on their pensions, and I'm no exception." "A part-time job? At your age?" David sounded like he was 72, not me. "Mom, be realistic. Who would hire a woman your age?" His words hurt, but I didn't let it show in my voice. "We'll see," I said. "You might be surprised at the possibilities of the modern world." David was silent for a moment, contemplating a new approach. "And the children?" he asked at last. "They're used to you. They miss you." "Ashley cried when she found your note. Brandon asked why you didn't say goodbye. That hurt." The children could indeed be upset, though hardly over the loss of their grandmother per se. It was more about the disruption of routine, the disappearance of someone who cared about their comfort. "Tell them I'll always be glad to see them," I said. "Let them come to visit whenever they want. The door is always open." "It's not the same," David insisted. "A family has to live together, especially in difficult times. We have problems, yes, but they can be solved through communication, compromise, mutual concessions." "What kind of compromises?" I asked curiously. "Are you ready to apologize for offering to be your official maid? Is Christina willing to admit that she treated me disrespectfully? Are the kids willing to help around the house instead of just using my services?" David fell silent. Apparently, there had been no family council on these matters. "We need time," he said finally. "Time to think things through, to find the right words, to work out a new way of relating to each other." "You have time," I agreed. "I have my own life, which I intend to live as I see fit." We talked for another half hour. David tried to find arguments that would make me reconsider. He talked about family obligations, about my responsibility to my grandchildren, about how hard it would be for them to cope without my help. But all his arguments boiled down to one thing. The family needed a free housekeeper, not a full-fledged family member. By the time I hung up the phone, it was dark outside the window. The street was lit by street lamps, creating a cozy atmosphere of an evening town. I turned on the table lamp, picked up a book, and settled down in the reading chair. No one could disturb me. No one demanded that I make a late dinner or iron tomorrow's clothes. The next 2 days were spent exploring my new life. I found the nearest supermarket, pharmacy, library, post office. I got to know my neighbors, an elderly couple who lived a floor above, and a young woman with a small child from the apartment across the hall. Everyone was friendly but not intrusive, which I liked a lot. On Monday, I went to the city library to inquire about volunteer positions. The librarian, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a warm smile, told me about programs for the elderly, computer literacy courses, and hobby clubs. "We have a detective group that meets every Thursday," she said, "and a history club on Tuesdays. We're also looking for helpers to work with the archives. A lot of old documents need to be sorted out and cataloged." Working with the archives sounded fun. It reminded me of my days at the detective agency when I was organizing information, looking for connections between facts, reconstructing the chronology of events. Skills that seemed lost could prove useful. On Tuesday, David called again. This time his tone was softer, almost pleading. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation," he began. "Maybe I was too harsh on Friday. Stress at work, tiredness, not an excuse, of course, but an explanation." I listened in silence, letting him speak. "Maybe we really did have the wrong relationship," he continued, "taking your help for granted, not expressing enough gratitude, but we can fix that." "How?" I asked. "Well, we'll appreciate what you do more. Saying thank you, taking an interest in your needs, involving you in family decisions. As a full member of the family, not, well, like you said." David was trying to find language that didn't sound like an admission of guilt. "And the offer of an employment contract?" I reminded him. "Forget about it," David said quickly. "It's a stupid idea, ill-conceived. We're dropping it completely." "And the nursing home?" "Forget that too. Nobody's going to send you anywhere. You're staying with us as long as you want, on whatever terms are right for you." The words sounded right, but there was no sincerity behind them. David was saying what he thought I wanted to hear. What he didn't understand was that the trust broken by one careless conversation couldn't be repaired by simple reassurances. "Thank you for your apology," I said. "But my decision remains the same. I'm happy with my new life, and I'm not going to change it." "But why not?" David wouldn't give up. "If we admit mistakes, apologize, promise to change attitudes, what more do you want?" That's a good question. What did I want? Respect, independence, recognition of my rights as a human being and not as an attendant? All of those things, maybe. But most importantly, I wanted to live my own life, to make my own decisions, to be responsible only for myself. "I want to be free," I answered simply. "Free from us." David's voice sounded resentful. "Free for myself," I corrected him. "That's not the same thing." After that conversation, he called several more times over the course of the week. Each time he offered new reconciliation options, new terms for my return. But I was adamant. The bridges had been burned, a new life had begun, and there would be no going back to the old. By the end of the week, the calls stopped. David apparently realized that his arguments were not working and gave up trying to change my mind. This brought relief, but also a slight sadness. No matter what, he was still my son, the only close person in the world. But the sadness quickly dissipated in a whirl of new things to do and experiences. I signed up for the Library Club of Lovers of Detectives, began to work with archival documents, met several interesting people. Life took on new colors, new opportunities, new meanings. In the evenings, I sat in Harold's chair by the window, reading books, planning the next day. Behind the glass, an old linden tree rustled with leaves. Neighbors strolled along the street. Lights flickered in distant houses. The world was big and interesting, and I was finally free to explore it. March brought an early spring to Stillwater. The snow had melted early. The buds on the old lime tree outside my window were swelling, and there was that special smell of waking earth in the air that always made me hope for the best. I had been living in my own apartment for 4 months now, and each day brought the small joys of independence. Working in the library archive turned out to be a real boon. I sorted out old documents related to the history of the city, systematized records, and made catalogs. The skills acquired in a detective agency 30 years ago came in handy more than ever. The ability to find connections between facts, to reconstruct the chronology of events, to distinguish the important from the multitude of details. All this became part of my daily life again. The head of the archive, Patricia Graham, was impressed by the quality of my work and offered me a small fee for particularly challenging projects. The money was symbolic, but it was recognition of professionalism, which meant more to me than any salary. "You have a rare talent for this work," she said as she looked over my cataloging of 19th century city building documents. "You see patterns where others see only chaos? Have you thought about getting back into this field professionally?" Her words got me thinking. In February, I happened to meet Jack Thompson, my former colleague from the Richardson Agency, at a coffee shop. He was older, graying, but still had the same energy and penetrating eye that made him a great detective. "Ruth Cameron," he exclaimed when he saw me at the table. "I can't believe it. How many years, how many winters." We talked for over an hour, reminiscing about old cases, mutual acquaintances, and amusing cases from practice. Jack told me that after Richardson's agency closed, he opened his own firm specializing in corporate investigations and background checks. "Business is good," he said, "but sometimes you need the help of someone experienced, someone who knows how to handle documents, understands people, isn't afraid of routine work. Remember the Stone case? You did a fantastic job with the paperwork back then." The mention of the Stone case made me tense up internally, but Jack didn't seem to notice my reaction. "If you ever get bored in retirement," he continued, "you're welcome. There's always a job for someone with your skills." I'd taken his offer as a friendly courtesy at the time, but Patricia's words made me reconsider the idea. Perhaps it was time to consider returning to a profession that had once brought me pleasure and a sense of self-worth. In mid-March, an event occurred that dramatically changed the situation in David's family. I learned about it on the morning news while drinking coffee in my small kitchen. Today, the city attorney's office filed a case against one of Stillwater's largest building contractors. The TV host reported, "Richard Stone, owner of Stone and Partners, is charged with corruption, money laundering, and grand fraud." I almost dropped the mug. The screen showed footage shot outside Stone's company office. Police officers were taking out boxes of documents. Investigators were sealing offices. Journalists were asking questions of tense employees. According to the investigation, the criminal activity was conducted between 1994 and 2024 years, continued the presenter. The damage to the city budget is tentatively estimated at $23 million. I turned off the TV and sat down in the chair by the window. So, someone had passed information about Stone's activities to law enforcement. Not me, of course. My jewelry box was still in the dresser under lock and key, but it was obvious that the investigation had other sources of information about the corruption schemes. The phone rang half an hour after the news. David called, his voice shaking with barely contained panic. "Mom, did you see the news?" he asked without preamble. "I did," I answered calmly. "It's a disaster," he continued. "A total collapse. The company is being shut down, all assets seized, employees fired with no severance pay. I was left with no job, no references, and a reputation for working for a corrupt firm. I listened to his complaints with a feeling that was hard to define. On the one hand, I felt sorry for my son, who really wasn't guilty of anything. On the other hand, justice had been served, and Richard Stone had finally been held accountable for his crimes. No one will want to hire me, David groaned. Everyone knows that I was Stone's right-hand man, that I was involved in all his projects. How can I prove that I didn't know about the violations? Probably hard, I agreed. Mom, I need your help, he said desperately. Not financial, of course. I realize you don't have much money yourself, but moral support, advice, just being there for me. It's such a difficult time. I'm asking for help. My son, who 4 months ago offered to be my official servant, now asked for support. The irony of the situation has not escaped my notice. What exactly can I do to help? I asked. Come home, he pleaded, at least for a while, until we get this situation sorted out. Christina's hysterical, the kids are scared, the house is falling apart. We need someone sensible, experienced to help us through the crisis. The house is falling apart. Interesting observation. In the 4 months I've been away, the family has not learned to function independently. Christine had apparently never learned the wisdom of housekeeping, and the children had not taken on any responsibilities around the house. David, I said gently, you're a grown man. You have a wife, children, higher education, years of experience in management. Can't you handle family problems without the help of your 72-year-old mother? But you are a family, he protested. Families help each other in times of need. There's that word again. Family. When they were comfortable, I was a servant. When times got tough, I became family again. Of course they do, I agreed. But only when the relationship is based on mutual respect, not exploitation. David was silent as he thought about what I was saying. Mom, I admit that we behaved wrongly, he said finally. Maybe we didn't appreciate you enough, took you for granted. But this is a different situation. We really need support now. And 4 months ago, you needed a free housekeeper, I reminded him. Needs change, but the principle remains the same. You only need me when you're unhappy. After that conversation, David called several more times during the week. Each time he described new problems, job rejections, financial difficulties, family conflicts. Christina blamed him for the loss of stability. The children demanded money for their usual entertainment. Creditors reminded him of payments. I listened to his complaints with sympathy, but offered no solutions. It was his life, his problems, his responsibility. I was no longer going to save grown men from the consequences of their own decisions. In late March, an encounter occurred that set a new direction for my life. Jack Thompson called and invited me to a business lunch. It turned out that he had been following the Stone case and was impressed by the amount of dirt the investigators had gathered. Someone has done a fantastic job of gathering evidence, he said as he cut into his steak. Documents, photographs, bank statements, chronology of events. It's a work of art. Only top-notch professionals could have done this level of investigation. I nodded, not giving away my thoughts. Jack didn't know about my role in the Stone case, and I wasn't about to enlighten him. Ruth, I'm thinking seriously about expanding the business, he continued. I need an experienced consultant, someone with your skills in document management and information analysis. Part-time, flexible hours, good pay. What do you say? The offer was tempting, an opportunity to return to a profession that was once enjoyable, a chance to apply the accumulated experience, to feel needed not as a housekeeper, but as a specialist. I'll think about it, I replied. Don't think about it too long, Jack smiled. Good people are in short supply, especially in our field. At home, I sat in a chair by the window for a long time, thinking about Jack's offer. Spring was blooming outside the window. The young leaves on the linden trees were getting bigger every day. The birds were building nests under the eaves of the neighboring house. The world was renewing itself, starting a new cycle of life. Perhaps it was time for me to start a new cycle too, not just to enjoy freedom from family slavery, but to build an active, meaningful life, to use the experiences of the past to create an interesting present. The next day, I called Jack and accepted the job. We discussed the conditions, the schedule, the range of responsibilities. Everything was serious, professional, and respectful of my age and experience. "Welcome to the team," Jack said when we signed the contract. "I have a good feeling about our cooperation." That same day, I got a call from Ashley. My granddaughter rarely called, but when she did, she spoke frankly, without the diplomatic tricks of adults. "Grandma, it's a nightmare at home," she said without preamble. "Daddy goes gloomy all day long. Mom is hysterical about everything. There's no money for anything. They're always fighting, blaming each other, demanding that we understand." "Is it hard for you?" I asked sympathetically. "A lot," Ashley admitted. "Sometimes I think it would be better if they were divorced. At least I wouldn't have to listen to their arguments every day." The child talked about divorce as the lesser evil compared to family squabbles. Sad, but not surprising. When adults stop thinking about children, children start thinking like adults. "Can you come back?" Ashley asked me out of the blue. "Just for a little while?" "Things were calmer when you lived with us." Of course things were calmer. Because I solved all the problems, took care of everything, made the rest of the family comfortable. But it wasn't solving, it was putting things off. "No, darling," I answered softly. "I'm not coming back, but you can always come to me if things get tough. The door is always open." "Thank you," Ashley said softly. "It's good to know there's a place where I'm welcome." After my conversation with my granddaughter, I thought a lot about the fate of people, the consequences of decisions, the fairness of life. David was paying for his callousness and selfishness. Christine was paying for her arrogance and consumerism. The children were suffering from parental immaturity. And I was building a new life. I was working, socializing with interesting people, discovering abilities that I thought were lost. I was living for myself, not to serve someone else's needs. Maybe that was selfish. Maybe a good mother and grandmother should have sacrificed herself for her family. But I had already sacrificed half of my life, and that was enough. The remaining years belonged to me alone. In the evening, I sat in a chair by the window with a new book in my hands, planning tomorrow's working day, thinking about the projects I wanted to realize. Behind the glass, the young green of linden trees rustled with leaves. Neighbors strolled along the street, enjoying the warm spring evening. Life went on. My life, which I had chosen for myself, and to which I was full mistress. It was a wonderful feeling to be free from other people's expectations and to live the life that felt right.